Hello, hello, everyone. It's Rochelle with Artful Leadership Coaching and Consulting, and we are here for another exciting episode of the Artful Leaders interview series. And I'm so excited to have our special guest today. We'll get into that in just a sec. But as you know, this series has really been about checking in with folks who are leading at the intersection of arts, education, healing, social justice, kind of looking at where we are right now and how do we tap into the wisdom of different folks and their work and what they've learned so that we kind of have a way forward through this unusual time that we're in. And there are just so many folks who are trying new things and experimenting, exploring, and sharing their wisdom. And it's been such a joy to feature so many of them on this series. And my work specifically is really about helping leaders to impact lives sustainably by really putting their own well-being first so that they can lead with a full tank and also create a culture of community care that can sustain folks, that can sustain students and staff and the whole community to make it through these crazy times together, right? We don't do it alone, and the strength of a community can really bolster us through these times. And that is one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have Dr. Kia Darling Hammond here today. We met in a breakout session in a class with Dr. Angela Costa on healing-centered education. And we just said, hey, we need to connect. And as we got to know each other a little bit, we really discovered we have a common passion for helping schools and youth development organizations and districts and leaders really thrive. And so we just want to invite you to join us today to really dream of a thriving future together. So Kia, I'm so glad you said yes. Yay! And why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself and your work and like what's alive for you right now at this time?
Thank you. It is such a thrill to be here. So I was really also excited to meet you in that sort of strange, random space and find that we were kindred spirits. And so I'm so thrilled to be here. Introduce myself. I think that probably the things that are maybe most interesting about me in relationship to this are that I've been in my professional life, done youth development programming and leadership, and I've been a teacher and a school administrator, and so I've had a lot of and a mentor and a babysitter, and so I've had a lot of touch points with the space of young people and trying to be in service to young people and their families and communities. And I am also a person whose story contains things like having to have my parents really advocate for me throughout my school experience and my life experience because it was easier for districts to track me into lower level classes because of my race and gender. That sort of thing is a big part of the experience I had that my siblings had. And as I kind of got older and once I was in my teaching career, I started to feel this real discomfort about what I was expected to focus on and the impact that that was having on my students. And so that's sort of what brought me into this work, and I can talk about that a little bit more later. But what's alive for me right now is this. We're in such a bizarre moment, right? Angela Costa, who you talked about, has been talking about there being a healing centered turn in education and in general. And so we're in this moment of profound crisis globally at the same time that we're seeing more women in positions of leadership, including state leadership, more people really focused on things like healing and social emotional learning, healing centered engagement, which comes on the heels of a particular attention to trauma informed engagement. So there's so much burgeoning now. There's so much potential right now to really build, put in place the design for this beautiful future. And it feels like, for me, that feels like living into the ancestral promise, right? The people who came before us and before them and before them, who poured their energy and love into the possibility of this moment so that we could pour our energy and love into the possibility of something even more beautiful, more vibrant, more open, that's really alive for me right now.
Oh, I love how you just put all of that together. That's really beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And so that's really what this whole talk is all about. And that is what I'm so excited to support folks with right now. And I know you are too. So you shared a little bit about your own pathway to this work on, thriving and centering, thriving. So can you tell us a little bit about your story? Like what was it that made this so important for you and your research?
Yes. So thank you for asking. This is like my favorite topic. So when I was teaching, the thing that I loved the most about teaching was actually not my content area, which was sort of humanities, social studies, English, journalism. What I actually loved the most about teaching was interacting with my students and getting to learn about them as people and figuring out what I could do to support their growth, support their development, facilitate them reaching their goals. And the moments that felt most powerful for me were the moments when they were really free about showing themselves. So one of my favorite moments was actually in my first year of teaching. I was teaching 11th grade, and this group of 11th graders, they were, a friend group, came marching into my classroom during lunch in this line, and they were singing a song that one of their younger siblings was listening to a lot. It was a cartoon, and it was about tomatoes. If you like to talk to tomatoes, and they're like, yes, I like to talk to tomatoes. Then it turned into this whole like clapping, stomping, walking around in a circle, call and response moment. And it was just irreverent and amazing and not related to anything that was required. And they were laughing and I was laughing. And I just thought to myself, this is absolutely the best moment I have ever seen. And I thought, like, this right here, this moment of just creativity and openness and vibing and community is exactly what I want to see more of, make possible, right? And I was really honored that that was something that they thought they could bring into the space that I was supposed to control, right? My classroom, because they claimed it as theirs, right?
Yeah.
So that for me was less common than, of course, all the other things that sort of happen in school and schooling. And almost every single one of those students at some point ended up needing for me to advocate for them in the face of some kind of adult consequence or punitive engagement, something. Oftentimes, more often than not, across my career, when young people have been in conflict with adults, the adults have had a role to play in creating that conflict or reinforcing the conditions for that conflict. I feel that. Thank you. So I just thought, we could do better. We can do better, and I want to do better. And also, I didn't want to be complicit in creating or reproducing or reinforcing conditions that got in the way of talk to tomatoes time, right?
Right.
So, and some of what I experienced, both as a teacher and as a school administrator, was very sobering. Some of the ways that the system and the system's actors could be really violent towards young people, towards their families, and as a result, towards their communities. And I got really exhausted by that. So part of the reason I started focusing on thriving was because I wasn't. I was getting sicker and tireder and losing my hope, right? Losing my energy. I felt like, and while that was happening, I was watching it happen in real time to other people too, the teachers, the administrators, the students, coming up against some of the desperation and strain and stress that communities were dealing with and not feeling empowered to help and feeling like the tools at my disposal were simply insufficient.
Yeah.
And so I ended up having to leave, like many people do, the sort of teaching space and the schooling space. And my vacation was a doctoral program. Um,
That
and it
sounds
actually
like
it felt like a vacation, which I think tells you a lot.
dreams. Yeah.
And I thought, I gotta figure out what my contribution can be and what other people have already done that's above and beyond this whole surviving and resilience thing, because this just isn't enough. And that is how I ended up studying thriving.
Mhm. Yes. So I love talking to you because I feel like we have so many parallel experiences where I started as a social worker working with unhoused youth and systems affected youth, and then kind of made my way into arts-based therapies because I was passionate about what happened when kids started to play and express themselves through the arts. And some of those life-changing moments for me were very similar to your tomato time, where we had, circles in the classroom and we had breakdance competitions and poetry slams, or just, whatever it was that showed up in the moment, or girls coming in the dance studio and dancing to Red Nose around the chairs, like all of those things, and just being like, this is what it's all about. And then, much like you, having had those experiences of their beauty, of their brilliance, of their vitality, of their community and their connection, being like, hey, when you're over here, trash talking this kid or excluding them or whatever, there's so much more to this student and to this community than just this behavior that's irritating to you in the moment or not working for you as an educator. So I feel like we're so on the same page with that. So you took a vacation into a doctoral program and then some other great stuff emerged as you figured out what your contribution was, and you've come up with this bridge to thriving framework. And there's something about that bridge that I just love. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the framework and kind of what it rose from your research as talking to young people about this topic of thriving.
Yes, so I'll share a couple of images in a moment, and just
Yeah.
to ground it, my the students, some of the students who I became very, very close to were Black and queer and same gender loving, and non-binary, and those relationships also gave me a lot of space to do my own identity work. So in that sort of burgeoning first stage of my teaching, I was also finally taking ownership also of my own queer identity. And I was doing this, right on the cusp of 30, which to me felt very late. So what was really important to me was that these young people who had, were half my age, were encouraged and supported and nurtured and held safe as they luckily so much earlier were able to sort of lay claim to their selfhood, their sort of increasingly full selfhood. And so when I got into my doctoral program, a lot of my relationships with students have persevered, and I mentor and am even claimed as a auntie to some of them, which is like the proudest thing for me, is somebody claiming me in that way. And so I was in conversation with these young people, and what was happening that was so interesting was they were also bringing their friends and community to me. So my auntie, group was growing. My mentor group was growing, and I just started to create sort of space, right? Space for us to gather, space for us to be together. And people kept saying, yeah, I love this because there's nothing like this anywhere else in my life. And look what we can do together. And so I thought, okay, this is the key. So I began really looking into this question of what is thriving at these intersections of being Black and queer or trans or non-binary or same gender loving, and young, right? Adolescence to young adulthood, because systemically adultism, racism and anti-Blackness, and trans and queer phobia, cis heteropatriarchy are all very powerful in the lives of these young people and in our world, and dictate outcomes across the lifespan in
Yeah.
powerful ways. My first interviewee was actually one of the young people that I was in community with, and they helped me refine the questions, design the tool, and then help me find participants for the study, which then sort of snowballed out into this larger community of queer, trans, non-binary, and same-gender loving young people of color. My ultimate analysis focused on the Black community because that was the largest group and interconnected in really interesting ways. But there, over and over and over again, as I asked them, what does thriving mean to you? What does your thriving look like? What would you need in order to thrive? A bunch of things sort of started to surface over and over again. So that sort of developed into this framework.
Yeah.
Um, and can I say a couple things about that? What I thought was really magical.
Yes, yes.
One of the really magical things, I say this all the time, is that every single one of the preliminary people I talked to, and almost everybody I've talked to since, has said, nobody's actually ever asked me to talk about my thriving before. Nobody's ever asked me to articulate a design for my thriving before. And I was like, oh, well, there's something there. Let's keep
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
And then because I talked to them over time, I let some weeks pass, and then I caught up with folks and I said, so have you had any new thoughts about thriving? And they were all like, yes, let me tell you about all the ways that I've started to live my life with an orientation toward my thriving. So there's this way that it like grew.
Yeah.
And actually one of the participants, I was actually just talking to them a few days ago, and they said, I take out your thriving framework all the time when I'm thinking about what it is that I want to do. And they're in a little bit of a moment of transition in their life, and so it was so great to hear them say, this is I help myself anchor into possibility. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. My training as an expressive arts coach drew a lot from solutions focused brief therapy that really focuses on like, what do we want versus like getting stuck in overanalyzing the problem. And the arts-based work is a lot of decentering from the problem into imagination, into play, and then going, okay, what did we learn over here that we could maybe use as a solution? Because the problem often has very little to do with the solution, right? And so I love that approach of let's focus on what we want and what shifts when we think about how we want to feel and what thriving looks like. So yes, keep going.
yes, I love that because it's about casting beyond the limiting beliefs, casting beyond the boundaries. And in this case, with my work, it was also an attempt to cast beyond the sort of the boxes that society invites us to occupy, because that's not the future that we're trying to build.
Right.
So yes, okay. So if I can, I'll share my screen and I'll just show the just two quick diagrams. Oh, it's telling me I have to install something. Can you see this?
It's on. It's up.
Great. So this is the framework. And hopefully you can see. Can you see pretty well?
Yeah, it's crystal clear. Looks great.
Okay, wonderful.
Can you see it?
I can.
Okay, good. Okay.
The technical, gods are smiling. Okay, so thriving in my conversations with young people, and since these elements, these sort of dimensions surfaced, and at the very heart of it always has been community. And within community, people talked about, not only finding community by being engaged in social justice, but also having their community help them learn how to be engaged in social justice in a way that helped them feel like they could thrive. Affinity community was critically important. Chosen family, of course, and that's particularly salient in communities like queer, trans, non-binary, and same-gender loving community, where there can be family rejection, and so your kinship relationships beyond the family of origin really matter. Not just feeling a sense of belonging, but feeling a sense of true belonging, like my whole self. is welcome here, and finding community that allowed that to be part of their life was very healing and very invigorating. And then critical consciousness was a big part of people not only refining their sense of critical consciousness, their power analysis about the world and its systems and institutions through community, but then feeling better able, because they had a strong community, to really question beliefs and to expand their consciousness. So, you know, that kind of stuff, these elements all supported people feeling like they were thriving in community. And I'm going to say this, a lot of times models are linear. This model is not linear. This was the best that I could do to kind of create something that encapsulated all of what people were telling me, but community and abundance and selfhood and pleasure all overlap.
Right, right, right.
You know, sometimes pleasure is, you know, through community, and community is through pleasure, and so on. So
Yeah.
selfhood is about identity, knowing ourselves, loving ourselves, and asserting ourselves were all a big part of how people anchored into their selfhood and identity as a way of thriving. And in particular, not surprisingly, having an identity that was resistant to these boxes we were talking about. You know, these ideas that you can only, you know, be in a certain kind of relationship, or that the only way to be a successful adult was to hit key developmental milestones, you know, which are very heterosexual in nature, you know, and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And then, yeah, self-determination through a political and a psychological lens, right? Like politically, I have the right to decide what happens with my life, my body, and my future. Psychologically, I am oriented toward an authentic future for myself, the thriving future for myself. Um, and then abundance. It was interesting because there was a lot that was about sufficiency, right? I have the resources that I need to survive. But beyond that, when there was thriving, it was because there was a sense of hope. There were dreams, there were aspirations, but also there were resources in place that were beyond survival resources, right? Like I can live in a community with other people like me. I can afford to live there. I can afford to take advantage of the cultural opportunities there. That abundance was a big part of thriving. And then pleasure, and I know we're going to talk about this more. Uh, it was so important to be able to be expressive and joyful and happy, but also a big part of the thriving paradigm was having a sense of purpose, and a sense of meaning and mattering in the world, right? Being able to pursue something that was, again, authentic to the self, the spirit, that sort of deeper part of us that seeks an opportunity to be expressed, which, again, in schools was not the center of the curriculum or the culture, right? And then relief. Everybody who was thriving or could describe thriving had an aspect of relief in their story, usually something really profound, a really serious difficulty or source of pain was resolved. And so there was sort of this big elation, this big moment of reprieve that presaged the thriving that they were going to be able to do. And sometimes that sense of relief, you know, was threaded throughout. So sometimes it was their safety. You know, I finally landed stable housing. Sometimes it was somebody else's safety. My mother left that abusive relationship finally. Sometimes it was having the freedom to explore, in one case, like more about their own identity and heritage and history in a way that hadn't been possible before college in this case. Sometimes it was gaining access to mental health care that actually worked for them, right? And so on. So relief was a big piece. And this is an important place to say that thriving is not like an ultimate or permanent state, that people describe thriving as something that can be in some aspects and not others.
Yeah.
So maybe they're thriving in community, but not at their job, for example. And also that it, you know, it can come and it goes. But that what was happening that was so interesting was people's orientation toward and sense of entitlement to thriving allowed them to put into place things that made more thriving and longer thriving possible moving forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And then this is the coolest thing. When people had all of these things, sort of all of the 5 dimensions that are the petals all at the same time, they kept telling me stories about being able to simply be, right? Like being able to just exist fully, stories about wholeness. Um, so that's sort of, those are the dimensions of thriving. Questions, thoughts?
So many, so many. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that just comes to mind so much with this, and I know we talked a little bit about, the shift to trauma informed or healing centered work in educational spaces with folks that I train or that I work with, or educators that I talk to, often are kind of intimidated. Like they're like, oh God, like I'm not a counselor, I'm not a mental health specialist, I don't know about all these things. But I feel like it's so important when you look at those petals that you have, like community and having those healthy relationships, and then experiencing that, the just joy and pleasure and freedom and relief and all those things, are so healing. And that healing doesn't come from sitting around and talking about our problems. It comes from experiencing connection and belonging and freedom and a place to dream and be ourselves and explore and all those things. And I love how the petals kind of really illustrate that. And it's really wellness from a different place. And it's not that we don't need those mental health supports, obviously we do, but for those who are not trained in those modalities, there's so much available to you to be able to create healing for young people without all of that. So that's what I love about this. And also that idea that thriving, we're in relationship to it, right? And it's a cycle, and some parts are doing well and some aren't, and it's kind of like a place we keep dipping into. And I have a feeling you're going to talk more about that.
Yeah, and I think there's something about pouring, how you get energy poured back into you, right? Because
Yeah,
being in difficulty or hardship, experiencing trauma takes a lot out of us
yeah,
physically and
yeah,
emotionally. And sometimes the healing process is a prolonged process,
yeah,
often. And so, but in the interim, how can we pour back into ourselves? And so, like, sleeping well is a way to pour back into ourselves, laughing with our friends is a way to pour back into ourselves, dancing freely, is a way to pour back into ourselves. And so I really do love that we can create the conditions that
yeah,
make healing more possible,
yeah.
and also focus on creating conditions that feel vibrant and where people get to be whole. Um, yes, I love that so much. And then was there a question? I'm sorry, I got lost in
Oh,
my.
no, I think did you have another image that you were going to share? Yeah.
Yeah, so this sort of, to put it into the perspective of the bridge to thriving, right? As a sort of a journey, I will share my screen again. And hopefully everybody can see this. Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to hide the meeting controls because they get in my way. But basically, the Bridge to Thriving accounts for a few different things. And one of those things is, as you said, that there are these places where we need to pay attention to resilience and healing and survival. And so there is this place where we have to be focused on performing things that allow us to survive spaces like schools, where there's a particular set of skills or behaviors that are valued, and without which we can become more vulnerable, or even be excluded. And so that's that concept of the master's tools. And oftentimes, in that space of survival, we're grappling with either insufficiency or just sufficiency. We have enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. And so the challenge of a society like ours that is actually quite oppressive, especially to some members of the society, is that we can end up pouring all of our energy into survival, and that is, I think, dangerous. And so the invitation of the Bridge to Thriving concept is to, yes, pay attention to survival and resilience, that is important. But don't forget to cast forward and to be in design and dreaming around the possibility of thriving. And so you'll see here the sort of 5 dimensions that lead up to simply being here. And then there are all of these things that people talk about that help them either to thrive in real time or to design or build toward thriving over time. So self-compassion is a big one, being gentle with yourself and giving yourself the space to be a learner who's growing. I feel like it might be Toni Morrison who said, you do the best you can until you know better, and then when you know better, do better. I could be wrong about that. I hope I'm not misquoting, but that conceptually is a really important part of being able to free yourself from the stress of perfectionism or the fear of failure, where the failure has some sort of dire consequence, and instead be able to be in growth and in possibility. And so similarly, a resistant identity, not letting yourself be made small, not letting yourself be in a box. Often that happens in relationship to community. It requires a sense of sort of abundant and hopeful thinking, that sort of thing. And so I'll let people take this, and I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's really
Absolutely.
rich. The cool thing is when folks look at the video, they can pause it. They can go back and, edit more deeply.
But the idea is really to be in the space of both and thinking. Yes,
Right.
we do have oppression and trauma, and that is real, and that is urgent. And if we put all of our energy into that, we lose this. Not only does that sap vital energy, right? We see the burnout. But we lose the opportunity to actually really be designing for a world we still haven't seen yet. And that designing requires dreaming.
Yeah.
It requires free dreaming, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I was on a call. I recently got my certification in healing-centered engagement with Dr. Sean Ginwright and the Flourish Agenda crew. And I was on a call with him, and he was just talking about just when you look at physiologically what happens when we've been in kind of a trauma space. When we begin to dream, we actually build new neural pathways, and we actually build our brain and build our capacity to experience something other than survival. And so, and I think that is so important to spend time imagining, even if it feels like, oh, that's never going to happen or that's never possible. But like you alluded to it at the beginning of our talk, of like those ancestors that spent time dreaming what we have and what we take for granted today. How can we offer that to those who come after us, and really taking the time to give ourselves permission to really imagine, what if, what if?
And I think that the invitation then to educators, right, is to try to, in the spaces that they do have control over, create that container for dreaming, for what if, to sort of take away the factors that constrain and even lead to that'll never happen thinking. So a lot of ways to do that.
Yeah. And how do you invite students and colleagues of all ages and all power dynamics to do that together? And how empowering it is when we all, because it's one thing for me to dream, but if we do it together, kind of increases the chances that some of those things might actually happen. And that's exciting, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it's super important to let young people to look to young people and make it possible for young people to be leading a lot of that, because they are so much closer to the stage of life where you haven't molded yourself so that you're surviving in the boxes completely, right? Those of us who, once you become a parent or you have a mortgage or, you're trying to kind of survive in the system, it's a lot harder to be flexible in thinking, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. That's brilliant. So, one of the things that I love to ask a lot of folks who I get to chat with on this little series is, when it comes to your own thriving and your own self-love, starting with you, what are some of your personal practices that really help you to flourish in the face of all these challenges we've named?
Yeah, so the for me, again, community is really at the root. So being in relationship to people who I love, who love me, and hopefully more often than not, joyful relationships. So we're laughing, we're not taking things too seriously. So I have a friend with whom I watch shows. We're not in the same location. They're in Utah right now, but we'll like watch a show together, and we're really good together because neither of us minds pausing and chatting about what we're watching.
I
Like,
love
yeah, that matters because you got the people who are like, just shut up and let me watch the show, right? So we're a good fit, and that's really joyful for me. And we both like really esoteric, bizarre stuff. So the thing that we watched most recently together was Dispatches from Elsewhere. So good, wow, weird, loved it. So that gives me a lot of joy. Um, and then, of course, sleeping. When I was a school teacher and a school administrator, I stopped sleeping and I got very sick as a result. My body just went into shock and my nervous system got all jacked up. Then I went to graduate school, and even though that was a lovely experience, I still couldn't quite get myself back into sleeping regularly. So that's been a project for me for really about a decade now, of learning how to sleep again. So that is a huge thing for me because it affects everything, right? Every system, my sense of optimism, everything. So sleeping. And actually, one thing that I'm very glad I was able to do, I know this isn't possible for everyone all the time, but I stopped working full time in a W 2 job and decided to strike out as an independent contractor, um, which gave me a lot of psychological, and physical space to, one, operate in a sense of purpose instead of in somebody else's sense of purpose, to control my time and energy in meaningful ways, and three, dream. Again, this has given me so much space to imagine. I don't know what 10 years will look like, but right now I feel a lot better able to imagine that. So
Thank you for sharing those. I love hearing people's kind of like super quirky, unique things. Because, when you think about self care, we always have like those, we're going to meditate, we're going to do, but then I love hearing fun things like you're watching a show with a friend who's in another state and pausing to chat about it. That's so awesome. Um, so in closing, like as we're kind of wrapping up this wonderful, rich conversation, if there was like one last thing that would be kind of like your message to educators, or what's the one thing you wish they knew that you want to leave them with today?
whoa, that's like a big, wow, that's kind of a
You
tall.
can take a breath.
Maybe some things that were helpful for me as an educator. Um, One was that, as important as it is for us to learn how to think critically, um, it is also critically important for us to think creatively and expansively. And two, that the thinking is not the be all and end all of the educational experience, of the developmental experience. So my content instruction was not anywhere close to as important as my relationships with my students and their relationships with each other, and their ability to be self-determining in their thinking about the conditions that they were living in and through. Um, and it, all of that, anything that was on a test was not as anywhere near as important as being able to be connected and in joyful community with one another, and also in productive relationship care, right? So sometimes we're not joyful, but we take care of ourselves and one another. That this pandemic has shown without any equivocation how critically important mutual care and mutual aid and mutual commitment are. And if we were living in a society that had already figured that out, we would not be still in struggle around this right now. So that's it. There's a lot that's very distracting and noisy in the space of schooling, which I differentiate from education. And the reality is, when it comes down to it, anchoring into humanity and anchoring into the purpose of living a life actually is, can dull some of that noise. And then I think maybe in relationship to that, because it's hard to be a rabble rouser and a rebel in your spaces, especially taught institutional spaces, is take your sick days, like take your breaks. I had a colleague who had friends who were getting married at least every 6 weeks. And I think they got called to jury duty 3 times a year. Okay. They had obviously looked at the calendar and said, I'm gonna need a 3-day weekend here. I'm gonna need a 3-day weekend here. And they just scheduled it. There are ways that you just use that time and that space to create opportunities to breathe and reflect and do that. And we need each other. At one point, a colleague went on maternity leave, and a bunch of us donated our 6 days to them so that they could take a longer leave. Like, we need each other to create the conditions for survival so that we can create the possibility for building the conditions for thriving.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much for hopping in here and sharing your life experience, your story, your research, your framework with us. If folks want to connect with you, where do they go? What do they do?
I am really bad on social media, but you can follow me. I guess I'm on Twitter at Dr. Kia DH, and I'm on Instagram, if you could call it that, at Dr. Kia DH. I have a website that people can go to and marvel at how pitiful it is. It's really needing some love and attention, but you can email me at kiadarling@wisechipmunk.com. I love being in community with people, so I love to hear I've met so many people just by them saying, hey, I think you're interesting and here's what I'm working on and can we connect. So that's probably the best way. And there's more forthcoming, and I will fix my website, so there'll be opportunities to see what's going on.
Yeah. And one thing I did want to throw out there is that I believe you're part of this Thriving Teacher Summit.
Yes.
Say anything about that? Because I know that's something you and Maria and Angel are working on.
Yes, through the Thriving Teacher Project and Angel Acosta's Burgeoning Acosta Institute. There is a Thriving Teacher Summit coming up, and now I'm like trying to scramble to find my calendar so I can tell you when. Do you happen to know when off the top of your head?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but I can like post a link or something in the comments.
There's also a Healing-Centered Education Summit coming up as well in October. And I'll be speaking about thriving in both of those spaces and ways that people can apply their own concept of wholeness, their own dreaming and imagining about the conditions for wholeness and sort of really these ways of thinking about thriving to building, educational practice or self-practice.
Yeah, the Thriving Teacher Summit is on September 26th. And I think the Healing-Centered Education Summit is like a week-long thing, right? Yeah. And I'm going to be involved in that as well. So I'm excited about that. So yeah, lots of opportunities to continue the conversation and look at how we do this together. Don't do this alone, people.
Yes.
Let's do it together.
Yes.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, thank you again so much. I look forward to seeing you in different spaces in the near future.
And
Have,
thank you.
yeah, you're so welcome. All right, take care, Kia. Thanks so much.
Thanks.